Well,
Okay, are we on?
according to the internet, we
The
will
internet
be.
has said we're on. Oh, that's amazing.
Let's check
it's
with
an
reality first.
okay. Check with reality. Good idea. Wait a minute. I must say that
Hmm.
we might want to take a second to before we start, just to check with reality. You're saying,
Reality
and
says it's happening.
I'm recording on Audacity, so that's even more reality.
I'm glad that you remind me.
Yes. So the moment that's set up, okay. So here we are. Um, just to make sure that we're all set, it's the 12th of March today in 2021. It's a good day to be alive, as every day is a good day to be alive. Um, it's the 1 year anniversary almost, well, a year ahead, a year and a day of the declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic as a pandemic by the World Health Organization. You're listening to Give the People What They Want, your weekly, every Friday, which is weekly, show on global news in half an hour with Zoe and with Prashant from People's Dispatch, one of the top movement storytellers at dot com .org. Sorry, it's one of those things.
It's .org.
Um,
It's .org
.org,
for all of our
obviously
listeners
.org,
who are
People's
typing
Dispatch
it into
.org.
Alexa right now.
And I'm Vijay from Globetrotter, back with you. Happy to be here. I wanted to start, guys, with the mention that today is the day when the Biden administration is going to hold a meeting of the Quad being the quadrilateral security dialogue with the governments of Japan, Australia, and India. This is quite significant because it's the first opening of the Biden administration. They say they're not going to emphasize China. That's what they say. Although I must say that's not really credible, because China will be at the heart of this. It's impossible for them not to put China at the center. And just before this meeting, the U.S. military essentially said that as part of their Pacific Defense Initiative, they're going to be spending. They've asked for a doubling of the Pacific Defense Initiative budget to $5 billion. It's a considerable amount of money. They're going to militarize Guam even further. And the head of the Indo-Pacific Command went before Congress, Mr. Davidson, and made the claim that, well, of all things, he said that they are not just preparing a military buildup on China to threaten China, but Admiral Davidson said they are preparing for a war. I think people need to take this quite seriously. I was surprised to see how little coverage there is on Davidson's remark when he said that they are, in fact, preparing for a war. And he said that there are many threats to the United States, but China is the only credible threat. That's the language that Davidson used. And Davidson also said that because it's credible, it's likely that the United States might need to go to war with China before 2050. He put a date to it, before 2050. We're at 2021. Some people might say, well, that's a long way to go. But he didn't say at 2050. He said before 2050. And these are two nuclear powers, one of them threatening war against the other. The Chinese, for their part, have had a very sober reaction. China did not say that the Quad meeting to be held today, 12th of March, should not be held. China said, continue, hold it, that's fine. But meetings like this, multilateral meetings, should not be held in order to persecute one country. By the way, guys, I just want to put on record that when the Chinese said this as a principled statement, in other words, it's okay to have a block of countries meet, even on a regular basis, the Quad, for instance, India, Australia, Japan, the United States can meet on a regular basis, but it should not have as its main agenda the prosecution of hostilities against a country. As you know, as I said, this is a specific claim, but they made a principled objection. This applies to the Lima Group, which has been meeting for the last several years, led by the Canadians. by countries in Latin America, like Colombia, for instance, at the heart of this. Their objective, of course, to prosecute a hostile environment for the government of Venezuela, to overthrow, in fact, the government in Venezuela. So I think what the Chinese said about the Quad meeting on the 12th of March, a very high-level meeting, it's a head of governments meeting, that the Quad, it can meet, but they shouldn't have as their objective regime change in China. And that, of course, applies to the Lima Group. But I was thinking about this. This applies in a way to NATO as well. What is the objective of NATO nowadays? Is it a defensive agreement against whom? They're talking about a Middle East NATO now, a Pacific NATO, an Asian NATO. Is this really the direction one should go in? And I'm going to say that next week at People's Dispatch and Globetrotter, I'll be writing a piece on the Quad after this meeting, and have been spending some time reading US government documents this week. I got to say, it's pretty chilling. It's not comforting. I was also happy to listen to the speech given by President Lula of Brazil, the former president of Brazil, who was acquitted of all charges. Happy to hear his speech where he basically said people in Brazil shouldn't be taking their orders from the United States. It was a very strong speech. He talked about the US dollar. He also said, we need to develop our own understanding of where we live in the world. Seems to me this is very much what the Chinese said in their statement with regard to the Quad. Zoe, you followed what's been happening in Brazil. It's quite exhilarating, I suppose, for the people there to have Lula out. It's, in a way, what some people are saying is the pink tide versus the toxic sludge. What's happening in Brazil, Zoe?
Well, it's a very good question, Vijay. And I think it's important to take a moment because, in Brazil, of course, we have this amazing news about Lula being acquitted, cleared of all charges, of all convictions, more properly, in the midst of a very, very challenging moment for Brazil. So we've been talking about it on the show a lot. Brazil continues to break record numbers of confirmed cases of COVID, of deaths. And so in the midst of this kind of deepening crisis, there is this incredible beacon of hope and of inspiration, which is the fact that on Monday, March 8th, the Supreme Court Minister, Edson Fachin, he essentially cleared Lula of all convictions that were made by the court in Curitiba in the Operation Car Wash case. And this is not necessarily for the reasons that we and of course, of the judge being extremely partial, meeting with the prosecution team. This was actually on the fact that it involved, he ruled that the court in Curitiba did not have the competency to rule in this case because it did not involve Petrobras. So it's kind of a technical decision, and now Lula will be retried in Brasilia. But of course, it's a tremendous victory in a case that has shook Brazil for the past couple of years since, of course, since the case started, but of course has intensified over the past 5 years, with the coup against Dilma, with the continued attempts to just wipe out the Workers' Party through slander, through this, concocted case by the right wing. I mean, we had a really great conversation with Daniel Giovanaz, who's a reporter from Brasil de Fato. He actually was covering the Lava Jato case, the Operation Car Wash case, when it was happening in 2016, 2017 in Curitiba. He was following all of these rulings by Sergio Moro, following the prosecution of Operation Car Wash, which is led by Deltan Dallagnol. And he was talking about, they've always known that this has been a politically motivated case. We have Deltan Dallagnol. He does a PowerPoint presentation and he just puts Lula's name in the center of this PowerPoint and then puts arrows towards him with all of the corruption cases that are taking place in Brazil. I mean, it's ridiculous. This was before Lula had even been officially charged with anything. There's just been a constant media war against Lula. There's been, the mainstream media partnership with the judiciary has been key in this. I mean, there's so many elements to unpack here, but I think finally this Monday, a first kind of sane ruling in the case. A first ruling that takes a look at the evidence, takes a look at what's really happening and says, okay, actually, these convictions were not correct. They can't be validated, and so there's going to be a new hearing. A key takeaway from this ruling is that Lula now has his political rights back. And what does this mean? In the 2018 elections, Lula was supposed to be a candidate. In April 2018, he was denied his appeal for habeas corpus, so he was arrested and he spent the next 580 days in prison. There were multiple attempts to register him as a candidate. The Landless Rural Workers Movement did this impressive, tens of thousand person march called the Free Lula March to demand that Lula's political rights be respected. There was a hunger strike, which saw militants from the MST, from trade unions, go on a hunger strike to demand that he be allowed to be a candidate. But of course, as we know, one of the main goals of having him prisoner was to deny him of this political right. But now with this ruling, and of course he did not contest in elections, which ultimately elected Bolsonaro. With this ruling, he'll be given his political rights. There's a lot of talk that he's going to be the presidential candidate in 2022. He has not confirmed this publicly yet, but I think it really signs a positive turn in Brazil, and hopefully a return to democracy, a return to a people-centered policies, and at a really crucial time right now.
I mean, a crucial time because the COVID pandemic is, continuing to escalate in Brazil. And I was interested to see, Zoe, that right after Lula's speech, Bolsonaro put a mask on. It's a fig leaf, but I suppose a fig leaf is better than no fig leaf. Meanwhile, of course, in South Africa, another country, another part of the BRICS bloc, we see the escalation of the COVID pandemic. And then, an old friend is back in South Africa. The dispute between the students and the government over fees. This was a big debate several years ago. The fees must fall movement in South Africa. Back again seems to be police firing rubber bullets, tear gas in the middle of a pandemic. A bystander killed. Prasanth, People's Dispatch has been following this. South Africa, shouldn't they be focusing on the pandemic? There we are, police firing rubber bullets. What's happening?
Absolutely, Vijay. In fact, our friends at New Frame have done a couple of really good stories on this and followed this up. And the fundamental issue, like you pointed out, is again something that's actually common throughout the world. The fact that at this time of crisis, governments have continued the broad framework of neoliberal policies. They have continued to sort of, not provide any relief at all. And a classic example is what's happening right now, because at the University of Witwatersrand, what we're seeing is that nearly 8,000 students were not allowed to register because of the historical debt they owe to the institution. And at a time when, for instance, students have, even those who are working have, students who are working have very little avenue to employment, sources of revenue have come down. There's all around, the poverty has increased. At that point of time, you have a university, you have an entire government actually privileging the collection of, debt, or privileging debt as the key factor when it comes to admissions. And just the idea that 8,000 students in one university alone are not allowed to register shows you the extent of the problem. And this is just one part of it. The university was also considering increasing fees at this point of time. Again, it shows the sheer insensitivity of the system. So when you, instead of talking about debt relief, which is what students not only in South Africa but across the world have been demanding. For instance, we saw very similar demands in the United States. We have seen similar demands across Europe. But instead of all this, we have, say, governments and education institutions acting primarily as, say, agents of the status quo, pretending as though nothing has changed in the last 1 year. And it's bad enough that student debt is an issue even in a non-pandemic year. The fact that students have to spend their time studying while thinking about how much they're going to owe is itself an insult. It is a blow that it's an attack on the future. It's not just an attack on the present, it's an attack on their future as well. But that this happens in the year of a pandemic is all the more atrocious. And we see the students, of course, starting to protest from March 5th onwards. And on March 10th, again, it was even the police minister called it crazy. But the fact is that a man in his 30s who was coming out of after doctor's appointment was shot and killed. And here we had students protesting peacefully, trying to raise their voices, trying to sort of convey to the government they were not going to they were not willing to accept what the university has done, and we have an innocent person, shot dead just because the police basically went wild, so to speak, for lack of better word. And again, this also is a very clear indication, because we have seen exactly in South Africa the same kind of attitude of the police towards all kinds of popular struggles. And this is something that the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa also really highlighted, that this is the kind of police response that happens when miners protest, when workers at, say, ArcelorMittal protest, workers across the country protest. This is what happens. When SAFTU did a strike last month, this was what happened as well. Their organizers were dragged in. So we see also a very insensitive, a very brutal police system, which sort of almost has made violence a common practice in responding to those who are asking for their rights. And the students are continuing their protest. Of course, they're calling for what is called a higher education debt bailout. And they're demanding that the university actually admit everybody and then pressurize the state for that. Not only that university, but universities across the country, students' movements across the country pressurize the government for a higher education debt bailout. And I think the important thing across the world is to realize that nowhere in the world is this impossible. For the giving a student debt bailout, or wiping out student debt. We've seen candidates across the world contest on these platforms. Even the numbers are clear that financially it is possible. It's just the lack of political will and the refusal of say authorities across the world to leave that paradigm of seeing education as a commodity. And so I think these protests are definitely going to continue in South Africa and across the world with very similar demands.
In fact, last night, the students at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi kept the central library open, because what they're also protesting, fees is a very important issue, Prashant, but also just the fact that they've been shut out from education. Last week, UNICEF, the UN Agency for Children, reported that 168 million children around the world haven't been to school. They say that 214 million children have lost 3/4 of their school time last year. By the way, the bulk of these, I'm looking at the report, the bulk of these are in Latin America and the Caribbean, in parts of Asia and so on. It's where you would expect. There's a pressing need to think about not just the digital divide, but the electricity divide. Places where there's insufficient electricity, how are you going to have digital education? If people can't afford to eat, how are they going to buy a computer? It's a malevolent thing. So when these students at JNU in Delhi said, open the central library, we want to come and study, what they mean is we don't have access to computers to study at home, and you're raising the fees. I mean, this is a very serious issue. Again, well reported, I must say, by, as you said, New Frame in South Africa, newframe.com, highly recommend it. Of course, it's a headache whenever we talk about Colombia. It's a headache. Something happens in my head when I think about how many people keep seeming to get killed there. And then, of course, the government makes some outlandish statements. I was shocked to read that piece at the People's Dispatch site. A senior government official, what did he call children, Zoe? I mean, it's ridiculous. We're talking about children trying to get to school, 168 million children not being in school last year. And what does the government in Colombia call children?
War machines. So
it's outrageous, right? What's happening there?
Yeah, I think every time we talk about Colombia, it's sort of a painful topic, because it seems that the genocide of the people of Colombia just continues unabated, and there's almost no international attention on this. And I think that's why we keep bringing it up, because it's just such a pressing topic. The atrocities that are being committed are so great that it's just we can't ignore it. This week, essentially, reports surfaced. There's an ongoing armed conflict in Colombia, just for people to know. Several large guerrilla groups have demobilized, but there's an ongoing armed conflict. The Colombian Army is one of the biggest in Latin America. It regularly carries out military operations So on March 2nd, it carried out a military operation, a bombing of what it called a FARC dissident camp. So as we know, the FARC demobilized in 2016. But of course, the government has all but respected the agreement. So several splinter groups from the main demobilized group have, rearmed, engaged in combat. That's a whole nother kind of story to go down. But essentially, the government had identified one of the camps of these FARC dissident groups and bombed it on March 2nd. And basically, what has come out in recent days through media reports, independent media reports from the ground, journalist Holman Morris, was that at this camp, there were minors. There were a lot of minors present. So when we're talking about, lack of opportunities for children, lack of opportunities for youth, Colombia is, of course, one of the most unequal countries in the region. And, youth are some of the people who are suffering most from this, without access to education, without access to proper resources. A lot of youth in Colombia, of course, find themselves either recruited to the National Army because it's obligatory. You have to join the National Army or pay a fine. And a lot of young people actually find themselves in illegal armed groups. And for whatever reason, this happens through sometimes forced recruitment and a slew of other reasons. So there were minors in this camp that was bombed. And essentially, the Minister of Defense has yet to acknowledge this. He has yet to acknowledge that minors were killed in this bombing. And Holman Morris, this journalist who's on the ground, essentially uncovered that as many as 14 minors may have been killed in this bombing. And what's, upsetting is that this is not the first time that the Colombian Army has an authorized military operation, authorized from the Minister of Defense, has killed minors in a bombing. And then, of course, denied it. They've both denied it and also said that children are trained to be war machines in these camps, and that once they commit a crime, they cease to be children and they become criminals. And so I think that's really important to underline, is that the government does not want to take any responsibility for the structural issues which bring children to have no other choice or be forced to be drawn into this armed conflict, which has been going on in Colombia for 60 years. It takes no measures to protect the lives of these vulnerable children, and then it violates international humanitarian law. And several lawyers have pointed out that this bombing was not necessary. The point of a war is to not annihilate your enemy. The point of the war is to pacify a situation and to have a solution to the conflict. But the Colombian army would prefer to kill all of the adversaries, and it doesn't matter if they're children. It doesn't matter what state of vulnerability they're in. They have no interest in this. And so I think it's just another very upsetting violation of human rights. Of course, there have been a couple of social leaders that have been killed this week. It just continues. And of course, they continue their embarrassing attack on Venezuela for human rights violations, they say, whereas their government just continues to massacre children. So, I mean, this contradiction, this atrocity just continues. We have to keep highlighting this. Also want to mention at the end of the month, Colombian movements and organizations are organizing a people's tribunal to try the Colombian state for these crimes of genocide, for these, crimes against humanity. So I think it's something to pay attention to. Movements are not just standing by, they're denouncing the government, and they're going to all instances possible to call out the government for their illegal actions.
You're with us at Give the People What They Want. That was Zoe Alexandra from People's Dispatch talking about Colombia. We've had some emphasis here, Prashant, on children. We talked about the UNICEF report, 168 million children out of school. Zoe has emphasized the murder of these children in Colombia, the indecency of the Colombian government to call children war machines. Of course, in Israel, Prashant, and in the occupied Palestinian territories, children have been considered to be war machines for a very long time. And the indelicacy of the Israeli government, they've used words worse than that, phrases worse than that. I follow Bet Salem on Twitter and so on, and I have to put myself through some of the videos that they post. These videos recently from Masafer Yatta in the occupied West Bank of these children being arrested they're grotesque videos. Prashant, I wonder if you could walk us a little bit through what the Israeli state has been doing to Palestinian children.
Absolutely, Vijay. In the sense that I think one of the issues, especially since we talked about the last two, three issues, is the fact that many of the incidents we talk about are actually reflective of some very strong structural crimes that we are seeing. That none of these are isolated incidents, but actually reflective of an entire system, a very entrenched system, so to speak. And I think the incident you talked about is yet another example of that, because you have 5 children between the ages of 8 and 13 who were picking up fruits or plants or whatever. Settlers who were from a nearby illegal outpost, which itself is a crime, according to most countries in the world, according to all laws that exist, come and scare these children, then called security forces. The security forces come and detain these children, and they're threatened and then they're released. And the two oldest children, who are 12 and 13, from that group, are asked to come back next week for further questioning. And apparently the logic behind this is that according to Israeli law, if you're 12 or above, you can face this kind of legal action. Now, this is just children being children, and this has been so normalized, which I think is the important thing that we need to keep realizing here, that this is not a one-off incident. This is not, as liberals often are happy to say, a case of bad apples, so to speak, which is the argument always thrown about, okay, this is some wild people doing some mistakes, but this is actually structural. And a very good example is the fact that every year over 500 children are prosecuted or they face legal action by Israeli authorities. There are at least 140 children who are currently in Palestinian children who are in Israeli jails right now. And I think this is, like I said, the key aspect of this whole fact is of this incident is the fact that this is so much centered around the settler colonial Israeli state, the illegal settlements, the illegal outposts. This is where so much of the violence takes place, whether you look at villages being demolished, whether you look at people being threatened, whether you look at children being threatened or detained these ways. And this is a clear case of apartheid, as many, many organizations have pointed out. And yet you have, for instance, the United States pretending as though Israel is a beacon of democracy. You have almost this nauseating discourse or dialogue around it, which again and again ignores the realities on the ground, that it's the men, women, and children of Palestine who every single day are facing these kind of atrocities. And even the risk of it, there some sort of desensitization happening, because there's this avalanche of regular news every day. So I think for people's movements across the world, it's so essential to have this issue very much front and center, because solidarity with Palestine is, I think, it is probably one of the most important movements right now, because it's a global struggle that is, there is no struggle for democracy, for justice, for any kind of rights without talking about and standing with the Palestinians, including these children who, for picking up plants, are now going to face police action and questioning week after week.
It's stunning, and I think coverage of this is so important. These are, after all, children, the children of Palestine, children of Colombia, again, the children who've had no school for a long period. There's some things that happen to language. This idea of war machines, the term used in Colombia, or this idea that these children in Palestine are terrorists or whatever. Language plays a big role. We forget that the government of Honduras, for instance, is effectively a coup government. So is the government in Thailand, and of course, so is the government in Myanmar, in what used to be Burma. I'd done a story for Globetrotter on Burma, but recently UN Women has been speaking out about sexual harassment of women arrested by the military, people protesting on the street. A very large number of women picked up because a large number of women have been protesting. We need to keep an eye on Burma, as we need to keep an eye on Honduras and Thailand. I think missing out on what's going on in these countries is something we shouldn't do. So we'll come back to Myanmar on another day. we just went through International Working Women's Day on the 8th of March. Today is the 12th of March. So happy International Working Women's Day. But it's not over yet. I'm told on March 13th, that's on Saturday, Zoe, there'll be a festival. In a few quick seconds, can you please tell us, orient us to that festival?
Yes, the International Week of Anti-Imperial Struggle, which is a platform of social movements, organizations from across the globe, of networks who are all united in the struggle against imperialism, have come together and are putting on a really special festival, which will feature culture, music, a couple of statements and messages of solidarity, in honor to honor this women's struggle that has been so crucial over the last year. We know women, are some of the majority of the frontline workers, the essential workers, but continue to, engage in deep and necessary struggles for their rights and for equality. So definitely tune into the festival tomorrow. It's going to be streaming on YouTube and on Facebook at the International Week of Anti-Imperial Struggle, also on Alba Movements. So you don't want to miss it. Be there, 9 a.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Brazil, and as such, it follows. So please tune in and you won't want to miss it.
You won't want to miss that festival, just as you don't want to miss Give the People What They Want every Friday, coming to you from Zoe and Prashant from People's Dispatch. Go along and bookmark peoplesdispatch.org. You will get some of the best movement storytelling, and you'll learn about Colombia, Israel, and Palestine. You'll learn about the quest for young South Africans to have an education. Give the People What They Want comes to you from People's Dispatch, also Globetrotter. I'm Vijay, happy to be with you this Friday, as we are on every Friday. I suppose we'll see you next week if you tell us that you still want us. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us you want us. It'll help us get motivated to come back week after week to give you a snapshot into the world. Are we okay, Zoe, Prashant?
We're
okay?
Great.
Okay,
Thanks
see you next week.
Farewell. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Great.